Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to address the main thing I want to address in this stream, and maybe one of two main things, is Daniel chapter 12, because this is something I didn't address in the debate because of lack of time, because you'll see it's super complicated. But basically, his argument was that the Islamic Empire cannot be the kingdom of God of Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, because in Daniel chapter 12, people resurrect. It talks about people resurrecting. So he says that it has to be a resurrection kingdom, meaning when the kingdom of God comes, people have to resurrect from the dead, and the Muslims didn't resurrect from the dead. Or when the Islamic Empire came, people didn't resurrect from the dead, so it doesn't work. That's his argument. This is the problem with the argument, is that Daniel chapter. So this is an introduction to the book of Daniel. Let's just read this. This is the Jewish study Bible. I want to see if I can get. Okay, let's just read this. This is a good introduction. So, by the way, Jewish study Bible, for those who don't know, is an academic commentary. In case anyone thinks it's rabbis, it's not. It's academics. Quote. This is on their section, Introduction to Daniel. So when you go to the Daniel section, it's in the introduction. Quote, Daniel is comprised of two equal halves of different genres and different origins. Chapters 1 through 6 consist of 6 court legends that utilize third-person narration to recount the adventures of wise Jewish heroes in the highest court in the land. ... The legends reflect an entertaining, humorous, even satirical side. Chapters 7 through 12 are made up of 4 apocalyptic visions, told in the first person, that are revelations of the events that led to the cataclysmic and transformation of history. And transformation of history, I think it's supposed to say. The two halves of the book appear to arise at different times in Israel's history. So this is an introduction to the book of Daniel. It's 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters are written first. Then the next 6 chapters were written afterwards. And then later on, in its final form, they were collected together. So these are actually 2 different books that have been put together that arise at different times from different histories. And even Rabbi Tovia Singer admits that Daniel has 2 authors. Now, I don't take Tovia Singer on Daniel seriously because he's, they don't take the evidence regarding Daniel seriously, but just an interesting thing to mention that even he acknowledges this.
Is there any, Judge, commentary on how far apart in time they are? Is there anything that that talks about?
So we'll get to
we'll get into that. Yeah, sorry, yeah. Good.
Now, the Jewish Study Bible continues. Chapters 1 through 6, probably originally oral, circulated most likely in the 4th to 2nd centuries BC when they were collected into a cycle of Daniel legends. Chapters 7 through 12 are most likely written compositions datable to the last year of the Maccabean Revolt, 164 BC. Then they write, the most likely reconstruction is that chapters 2 to 6 and separately chapter 7 were written in Aramaic and chapters 8 through 12 at a date slightly later than chapter 7 in Hebrew. Chapter 1 may have been written in Hebrew or translated from Aramaic into Hebrew as a more appropriate language for the introduction. So basically, the book of Daniel has 2 different languages. It starts off in Hebrew, and then it's in Aramaic from chapters 2 through chapters 7, and then it goes back to Hebrew. So what they're saying is that chapters 2 to 6 were written in Aramaic, then chapter 7 was written, then chapters 8 through 12 were written. So remember, in the beginning I said chapters 1 through 6 were written at one point, and then chapters 7 through 12 were written later. It's actually more complicated than that, because chapter 7 was written before 8 through 12. So the actual way this came about was chapters 1 through 6, then chapter 7, then chapters 8 through 12. And we'll look at some of the evidence for that. But another thing that's important to note here is that chapters 12 through 6 consist of originally independent oral stories. So they mentioned this on this quote here, that they were likely circulating in the 4th to 2nd BC as oral stories. So what this is like is the Gospels. In the Gospels, we have like stories about Jesus, quotes about Jesus, or sayings, and scholars say that these were originally oral stories, and then the gospel writers have like brought them together. They brought these sayings together, etc. That's the same thing with Daniel 2 to 6. These are different stories that were like court stories, and then the author has just brought them together. But they were originally independent oral traditions. The Jewish study Bible, in their commentary under quote Daniel 1:1-6.29, collection of court legends, say that this section, Daniel 1-6, is a collection of court legends. Chapters 1-6 probably circulated as independent stories before being collected and edited together. The New Oxford Annotated Bible with Apocrypha 5th edition writes that these court tales began as individual stories, probably, that were written during the Persian period. So the stories in 1-6 are oral stories that go back to the Persian period. Okay. And then they say clues embedded in the story suggest that the tale circulated independently among the Jews of Babylon and the Eastern diaspora until they were collected and edited as a book.
So that's
John
that's almost 300 to 400, over 400 years before they were finally collated, according to the earlier dating.
Years, yeah.
200-300. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and if you take the 500 period, then up until the Maccabean revolt, where the Book of Daniel would have reached its final form, it is like almost 400 years.
Yes, exactly.
This is what John J. Collins says. He's like one of the foremost experts on the Book of Daniel in the world. It is very likely that chapters 2-6 already existed as a collection of tales before the Maccabean period. These stories, however, require some introductions, such as is provided by chapter 1. Chapters 8-12 may be slightly later than chapter 7 and come from a different hand, though from the same circles. So, again, he's agreeing that chapters 2-6 come first, then chapter 7 is written, then chapter 8-12. So it's actually composed at 3 different times, and then chapter 1 as well, but I'm not really concerned with chapter 1 right now. Here's the evidence that he gives, John J. Collins, again, the foremost expert on the Book of Daniel, or one of the foremost experts. He's known as one of the greatest biblical scholars today. There are also discrepancies between the different units of Daniel that give rise to the view that they were independent, they were originally independent of one another. So, given the reason why we know that the first 6 chapters were originally independent stories, chapters 2-6, the chronological setting of chapter 2, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, is incompatible with the data of chapter 1, according to which Daniel had already completed a training period of 3 years, which had begun in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 3 is anomalous by the fact that it contains no mention of Daniel. It is also anomalous that Belshazzar in chapter 5, allegedly the son of Nebuchadnezzar, appears to be unaware of the existence of Daniel and of the experience of his father. The sequence of chapters does not follow consistent chronological order. Chapter 5 was set in the reign of Darius the Mede and makes mention of Cyrus the Persian, yet chapter 3 reverses to the reign of Belshazzar. These discrepancies have given rise to the view that the tales in chapter 1-6 originally circulated separately, whether in oral or in written form, and indeed they are to a great degree self-contained units. This view receives support from the fact that parallel traditions to some of the tales are extant in other works. For example, the prayer of Nebuchadnezzar from Qumran, in the case of Daniel 4, and the Deuterocanonical bell and the serpent in the case of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's chapter
the way you do it on the dryer.
You're not muted,
machine dryer.
I think you forgot. Okay. The provenance of chapters 1-6 remain in dispute, but these stories do not reflect the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes as the later chapters do, and must be dated to a somewhat earlier time. So what he's saying is, because in chapters 1-6 we don't have a reflection of the persecution of Antiochus, that these chapters and these stories must be before the later chapters where you have like Antiochus, etc. mentioned. So they must be somewhat earlier, and originally they were these like oral stories or maybe written stories, and there are different forms of these stories as well. So basically, Daniel 7 is later than Daniel's chapters 2-6, but both Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 to 6 are earlier than Daniel 8 through 12. Now, regarding chapter 7, the New Oxford Annotated Bible says this vision was likely written prior to Antiochus IV's reign and updated just before he desecrated the temple. And they say here that chapters 7 through 12 contain 4 separate apocalypses describing the end of Gentile kingdoms, with chapter 7 providing the connecting link between the later apocalypses and the earlier court tales. Although it has a view of imperial power similar to that of chapter 8, chapter 7 contains many parallels to chapter 2 and was written in Aramaic. Chapters 8 through 12, however, were composed in Hebrew, so again, chapter 7 is earlier. Jewish Study Bible again says chapter 7 is in Aramaic and may have been composed before 8 through 12. And like chapter 2, it has the 4-kingdom schema, a dream interpretation, and a 4-kingdom schema. 4-kingdom schema is basically, in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you have 4 kingdoms and then the kingdom of God. In Daniel 8 through 12, you don't have that actually. You have something slightly different. John Collins mentions that only chapters 8 through 12 are actually in the first person. Even chapter 7 has an introduction by the narrator before it switches to direct speech, so it's not actually in the first person. Okay, now Daniel 8 has this like kingdoms motif. So Daniel 4, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 have like the 4-kingdom motif, then God's kingdom. Daniel 8 is slightly different. In Daniel 8, the vision is a ram and a goat, and the ram has 2 horns, which represents Media and Persia, and then the goat comes. So John Collins gives some evidence that chapter 7 is earlier. He says, first of all, the fact that it continues in Aramaic, like the older tales, is one argument for this position. Another is that it contains no clear reference to the desecration of the temple, which looms very large in chapters 8 through 12. So he's given 2 arguments here why chapter 7 is earlier from chapters 8 through 12. Argument 1, it's in Aramaic, so it's in a different language from 8 through 12, which are in Hebrew. And argument 2, that if you read 8 through 12, it talks about the temple being desecrated, referring to Antiochus desecrating the temple. But chapter 7 has no such reference. So there's no historical reference to the desecration of the temple, and it's in a different language, indicating it's earlier. The Jewish Study Bible also mentions that 8 through 12, the visions are less poetic, more detailed, and more focused on recent events from the author's perspective. And the Jewish Study Bible also says that the traditional 4-kingdom schema is abandoned here. So chapter 2 has this 4-kingdom schema, then God's kingdom. Chapter 7, 4-kingdom schema, then God's kingdom. Okay. Chapter 8 through 12 don't have a 4-kingdom schema. We have a different vision in Daniel 8 of this ram with 2 horns and then a goat. So it's different. And the 8 through 12 is less poetic, more detailed, and it has references to Antiochus desecrating the temple. So it's different, which again indicates that these are different compositions. Now, Daniel 11, so this is the key. Daniel 12, which he said proves that Daniel 2 and 7 is the resurrection kingdom of God. Now, someone might argue that even if it's written later, it can still give us more information, so we can still use it. But the problem is that Daniel 12 is a false prophecy. So he's referring to a false prophecy to try and prove that the kingdom has to be the resurrection kingdom of God. But Daniel 11 through 12 is not from God because it's a false prophecy. Daniel 11 talks about Antiochus. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt. And then he says that he will come to his end and no one will help him, implying that he dies in Palestine, in Israel. Both these things didn't happen. Antiochus did not die in Palestine. I think he died in Persia, and he did not conquer Egypt. It's a false prophecy. And Daniel 12 continues. It's part of the same vision, actually. I know it's broken down into 2 chapters, but it's actually the same thing. It's the same vision continued. And it says, at that time, Michael, the great prince, will arise, and then the resurrection will happen. So if you read Daniel 11, what's happening, it's a very clear description of Antiochus through and through. It's like very accurate until you get to the end, where you have these 2 false prophecies, and then Daniel 12 continuing has a false prophecy that at this time the dead will resurrect. Now, guess what? None of those things happened. So that's why scholars say that Daniel 8 through 12 was written at the time of Antiochus, because the author got all the details right, because he's not actually prophesying this. He's writing after the fact, pretending like he's prophesying it. So that's why he gets all these details correct. But then at the end, he starts getting them wrong, because that's when he actually makes real prophecies, but he gets them wrong. So Deuteronomy 18 says, if a prophet speaks a word and it does not come to pass, the Lord did not speak that word. Because Daniel 11 through 12 is a false prophecy, this is not from God, whereas Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are true prophecies. So the appeal to Daniel 12 doesn't work. It's a false prophecy by a later author at a different time. So again, Antiochus did not conquer Egypt, as Daniel 11 says. He did not die in Israel, rather he died in Persia, and the dead did not resurrect after the death of Antiochus. This is what the Jewish Study Bible says under Daniel 11, 1 through 45. Under 40 to 45, from this point, the predictions do not correspond to events as known from other sources, and scholars agree that the author must have been writing at the time of the events described in the preceding verses. What is described is a cataclysmic battle of the major powers that would mark the end of the present age, but the campaigns predicted here did not occur. This indicates that the date of Daniel is in the middle of the persecution of Antiochus IV, before his defeat and the purification of the Jerusalem temple, commemorated with Hanukkah. So Daniel 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, then 3 additional pagan kingdoms, then God's kingdom. Daniel 7, we have Babylon, then 3 additional pagan empires, then God's kingdom. Daniel 8 through 12, we have Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece, then the resurrection. So the 4-kingdom motif is actually abandoned in Daniel 8 through 12. It doesn't talk about 4 kingdoms coming, then the kingdom of God. It's different. It talks about Babylon, then Medo-Persia as one empire, then Greece, then the resurrection. It's different, actually. Okay, with all this in mind, how should one interpret Daniel 2? There are only 2 ways to interpret it. I mean, there's technically a third way, but that's not relevant. There are only 2 ways to interpret Daniel 2 that are reasonable, I would say. There's the compositional context, and then there's the pre-compositional context, which means the original context. What does compositional context mean? Compositional context means, what does Daniel 2 refer to when it was written down? Like, what is the meaning of the vision when it was written down at the time of its composition? So what does Daniel 2 refer to within the larger context of Daniel chapters 1 through 6, which is known as Daniel A? The pre-compositional context is the original context, meaning what did the original prophecy of Daniel 2, when it circulated as an independent oral story, refer to? Because remember, Daniel 1 through 6 were originally independent stories that were circulating. So pre-compositional context means, what did Daniel 2 mean when it was floating as an independent oral story? And then compositional context means, when it was written down into chapters 1 through 6, what does it mean in the book itself? Let's deal with the compositional context. Within the compositional context of chapters 1 through 6, the Medes and Persians are presented as one kingdom. Chapter 5, verse 28, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then chapter 6 refers to, during the time of Darius, the Mede, it refers to 3 times, quote, the law of the Medes and Persians. So this agrees with the tradition in Daniel 8, where Mede and Persia is one empire. But the 4-kingdom schema isn't there. Even though it agrees about the one empire, Daniel 8 still doesn't have 4 kingdoms. It's different. John Collins says, even though he holds that the kingdoms are Mede and then Persia, he still notes that this there's some thing that doesn't quite gel, because he said the combination Media and Persia would be anachronistic if a Median kingdom preceded the Persian. Jerome observed, it is perfectly evident that there was only one kingdom of the Medes and Persians, both under the rule of Darius and Cyrus. So even though he holds that it's Mede then Persia, he's noting that there are things in the text which make it seem like Mede and Persia are together. Those are some other quotes indicating that as well. So if we understand then, based on chapters 1 through 6, that the second kingdom is Mede and Persia together, then the kingdoms would be Babylon, then Mede/Persia together, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. Okay, so that's the meaning within the book. But now what about the pre-compositional context? Meaning before it was written as a book, what did Daniel 2 mean when it's circulated as an independent oral story? This is the position I take, and this is the position I presented in the debate. So when we're talking about the pre-compositional context, we don't care what the other chapters say. We don't need to interpret Daniel 2 through Daniel 5 and Daniel 6 and Daniel 4, etc. We just interpret Daniel 2 independently at face value, because this was originally an independent oral story. So we're trying to see what did it mean when it was originally an independent story. So then we can try and figure this out by just looking historically. Historically, the kingdoms after Neo-Babylon were Persia, Greece, Rome, and the Islamic Empire. So it's very similar, but just the difference is instead of Medo-Persia, it's just Persia. Why? Because historically, the Mede Empire did not come after Babylon. It already existed. What Persia came and it conquered both Babylon and, if I remember, conquered the Medes as well. So historically, what happened was Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. And that just fits if we just take Daniel 2 on its face value. So that's the pre-compositional context, and that's the correct meaning in my opinion. But even if you want to interpret the book together, instead of Persia, you just have Medo-Persia. But if we interpret it on its face value, historically what happened was Neo-Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. So that's how I take it. The New Oxford Annotated Bible confirms the Medes never ruled over Judea. Cyrus the Great was king of Media and Persia when he attacked Babylon. John Collins says the inclusion of Media in the succession of world empires appears odd because Media never ruled over the Jews. Now, this is the four kingdom schema. It's actually found in other Near Eastern texts. Usually there you have like Assyria, then Mede, then Persia, then Greece. But note that in Daniel, we don't start with Assyria, we start with Babylon. Why do we start with Babylon? Because the Babylonians are the ones who exiled the Israelites, so they're that's a very relevant kingdom. Okay. Now, I think Daniel says, John Collins says, in Daniel 2, Assyria has been replaced with Babylon, quote, this is what John Collins quotes, for reasons obvious in the context of Jewish history. So in Daniel, we start with Babylon instead of Assyria because the Babylonians are the ones who exiled the Israelites and destroyed Jerusalem, etc. So we're seeing that the traditional four-kingdom schema that we find in these different Near Eastern texts, in Daniel, it's a bit different. We don't start with Assyria, we start with Babylon. Why? Because Daniel is concerned with Jewish history. So this is the Jewish view of history, the four-kingdom schema, but from a Jewish perspective. So from a Jewish perspective, we have Babylon, and then again, from a pre-compositional context perspective, after Babylon, we would have Persia, because Cyrus is the one who defeated Babylon and brought the Israelites back into land. Then from a Jewish history perspective, we have Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. So from a Jewish history perspective, we have Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. So Daniel 2 has a four-kingdom schema, but one which is in the light of Jewish history. In the perspective of Jewish history, Media is irrelevant. It never ruled over the Jews. It's Cyrus who came after, and he conquered Babylon. And even normally, like Mede was before Babylon anyway. So the way that Jews would have read Daniel 2 from a Jewish perspective is when it was circulating as an independent oral story is Persia, then Greece. Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, etc. So the Empire of the Medes was established in 678 BC. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was established later in 626 BC. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BC. So Mede does not match the description of the second kingdom in Daniel 2. It says the second kingdom arises after Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Quote, after Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Mede did not arise after Babylon. It already existed, and it did not conquer Babylon. It was Persia that arose, and it conquered both Mede and Babylon. The Babylonian dynastic prophecy is a text from the ancient Near East, and it orders the world kingdoms as Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, which is somewhat similar to the interpretation I'm mentioning here. So then, again, to summarize, if we interpret Daniel from its compositional context, based on Daniel A, we get Neo-Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. But if we go with a pre-compositional context, the plain reading of the prophecy matches history perfectly. Neo-Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then the Islamic Empire. Daniel 7, because it's later than Daniel 1 through 6, but earlier than 8 through 12, Daniel 7 can also be interpreted independently of the other chapters. We don't need to read Daniel 7 through Daniel 8 through 12 because Daniel 7 is earlier.